This video is brought to you by my Patreon subscribers. Thank you for your support. A few weeks ago, I went to Hamburg to see the German production of The Lion King. It's the musical theater capital of Germany, and for some, it's even the Broadway of Europe. And in the last 20 years, Disney has actually played a role in building that reputation. But unlike Broadway, the big musicals in Hamburg aren't all in a single area. They're scattered around the city, and if you want to get to The Lion King, the fastest way is by taking a boat across the Elbe River, and on the other side are two theaters, one hosting The Lion King and the other Frozen. I saw the touring production of Beauty and the Beast when it came to Berlin, but there was something different about seeing The Lion King, this huge, ambitious show, in the same theater it's been running in for over 20 years. And I always love hearing songs I grew up with in a completely different language and context. But watching The Lion King in Hamburg also got me wondering, how did this happen? Hamburg's journey to being a musical hotspot began in the 80s when Cats was the first Broadway and West End transplant to make its way to Germany. But though some were glad to have a new thing to draw tourists to the city, others weren't satisfied. And so with the new musicals came protests. University students marched through the city against the arrival of bourgeois musicals, and were particularly angry about ticket prices of more than $50 in a city where state-subsidized theaters had long kept prices low. The producer Friedrich Kurz recalled gleefully arranging for newspaper photographers to be on hand whenever protesters massed, including on opening night for Phantom in 1990, when Mr. Lloyd Webber insisted on walking the red carpet in his tuxedo in spite of hecklers. People were worried that a tourist boom would disrupt and gentrify local culture. And though the protests had nothing to do with Disney, they remind me of similar critiques of some of the company's attempts to expand internationally. For example, when Disneyland Paris first opened under the name Euro Disney, cultural imperialism became a topic of discussion, because for many people, it wasn't a French version of Disneyland, but instead just imposing US culture onto France. But Disney's representation worldwide is also a bit more complicated. I've talked before about different associations that the company has in Germany, even in ways that don't exist in the US, and the same could be said for nearly every other country where Disney has had a local presence. Which brings us to Catawiki, the sponsor of today's video. Catawiki is an online auction house that features world-class designers, antiques, and there are plenty of Disney-related things as well, from a variety of different countries. I'm someone who loves to learn about the many ways in which Disney has been represented outside of the US, and with Catawiki, you can not only find out more about how your favorite characters have appeared in other languages, but you can also own a piece of that history. And since every auction is expert approved, you don't have to worry about checking the authenticity of a particular item. The types of Disney items offered on Catawiki range from comics to drawings and even original artwork, among many other things. Creating an account is free, and if you sign up, you can not only bid on items, but also create lists of your favorite auctions so you can swoop in last minute. You can also follow various collections that group similar items together. And if you're unsure about how high to take a certain bid, expert estimates next to the item give you an informed opinion about how much it's worth, so you don't spend more than is necessary. Whether you're on the hunt for a specific Mickey figurine, want some unique theme park items, or you're just looking for a piece of Disney-inspired art to put in your home, you'll find what you're looking for on Catawiki. And the stock continuously changes, so each time you visit, there will be something new. And if you want to stay up to date with the latest expert-approved and checked Disney auctions, you can check out the Catawiki Disney Auction Instagram, and also the Disney Overview on the website. But yeah, go check it out, and thanks to Catawiki for sponsoring this video. But how do you bring a Disney show to Germany? Well, for starters, with translation. Since their first movie, Disney's success allowed them to tap into international markets with dubs. But while it's easy to think of translation as just making the original more accessible for other languages, it's also an art form of its own. Certain words and phrases just don't work the same way in German as they do in English, and so you have to make creative decisions about how you want to represent the text. And with The Lion King, I think the translations are pretty good at staying true to the original. And even if some specific wording is changed, the feeling of the original stays. Oh, ich will jetzt gleich König sein und im ewigen Kreis dreht sich unser Leben sitzt der Natur, sind wir geweiht. But that's just one way to approach translation. Full disclosure, I'm not a linguist, and it definitely can get more complicated. But previously, I've talked about how you can translate things literally or emotionally. And I mean literally as in communicating either the exact thing or something very close, and emotionally as still retaining the emotional meaning. But of course, these two approaches are often mixed. The balance of representing the original versus making the song fit the new language is what makes translation an art form, and within Disney, the approach can change with each translator and language. Unlike the German Lion King translations, the Greek version of Someday My Prince Will Come changes quite a bit, and is called Mia mera san kiafti. San mo besagta po menaglykoskopo olagiro muemi san fos metoyelio buscar bisavtos mia mera san kiafti no nafani ehokani mia fi monadiki ta onirafta nafron. In both versions, she's singing about hopefully meeting the prince again. But in Greek, the focus is on the past, while in English, it's the future. That might not change the story, but it does show how translation can change songs. Also, keep in mind that the only languages I know other than English are German and Greek, so my view on this is extremely limited. If there are any cool translation differences you want to talk about in other languages, please leave a comment telling me about it, because I'm super interested in learning more. Within Disney fan communities worldwide, translation can also be controversial. For example, in the original German dub of The Little Mermaid, Part of Your World was given a beautiful translation called Ein Mensch zu sein that takes the song to a different emotional space than the English version does. However, it was eventually replaced with In ihre Welt, a more direct translation of the original. To this day, many fans prefer the first dub, and a similar thing happened to that song in other languages. But back to The Lion King. It represented not just a translation of a US American film, but the musical would also represent a continuation of a new type of industry in the country. And something I haven't mentioned is that there are also people from the US working in German musical theater. To understand more about bringing The Lion King to Germany, John and I went to Rostock to speak with Darrin, Byrd, an actor who's lived in Germany for over 20 years and played Mufasa in the Hamburg Lion King. You moved to New York, but then you went to Europe on a trip to London.
That was while I was still in university.
Yeah.
This is what opened my mind to the rest of the world. And so from there, I had no boundaries. And so immediately after that, my time in New York, I decided to just leave because I had already been doing some touring and I had already been on world tour with Riverdance. So by this point, I was ready. Mm-hmm. And I came over in 2001. I was living in Florence. Mm-hmm. And from there, I got the job in The Lion King. I learned Italian first because I was living there. And then I learned German to do the show. Then learning German to understand German came after the show. When you understand the principles of the phonetics and you understand the principles of the language, it becomes much easier.
When writing music in a certain language, the music ends up reflecting the language in many ways.
Absolutely.
So how is that? Like, did you have a familiarity with the songs before you sang them in German?
I knew all of them already.
So then how was that singing in German with these songs that...
You know what I found? When I got the job and I started to go through it myself, because this was way before phonetics started, I found that it was very easy. The translation is absolutely breathtaking and amazing. And nearly word for word. For that, I was lucky.
Is there anything about performing in German musical theater that is different than American musical theater, US American musical theater? Like how the audiences interact with it, or...
You never know how the audience is going to interact.
Yeah.
You're always going to be surprised. And for a show like The Lion King, I have to say, you will know. because every time there's a standing ovation, every time they are going crazy because the show itself speaks for itself.
Yeah.
But as you get deeper into theater, like let's say cabaret or hair or whatever you're doing, you will always come up against a different audience every time. It's a lot younger here, but here in Germany, now it's a big thing. And so they start to fill the gap. They really do push for being excellent, for being disciplined, and for doing your job. Biggest difference I would have to say, though, is people are not scared for their jobs here. In America, I would never take off a show because the guy right behind you wants your job.
Yeah.
This is not existing here. People take off 2 days a week because you can. And if you only need a doctor's note if you're gonna be off that third day. And so that's a big difference. In America, you don't see that happening.
Darrin was in Rostock to perform the lead role in the Chormusikal Martin Luther King, a musical in German about the life of MLK. I hope this video will provide an interesting view into German musical theater, because I find it very fascinating as a US American who's like kind of home in Germany. Because musical theater, I feel like it's such a distinctly US American art form.
Absolutely.
And so to see it both adapted and then a show written in German, that's also telling US American history.
Right. For me, it brings me a lot of joy to do the show because it's so real and true, but the music is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
From jazz to soul to rock and roll to gospel, it's everything in there. And so from there, we're gonna have a good time.
Is there anything else you want to say?
Being a performer living abroad has brought me a fulfillment that I cannot really truly express, but I can say that I'm happy to be here and to be on the forefront and to be able to work and to be able to sprech die Sprache, to speak the language.
Yeah.
It gives me a sense of accomplishment to do what I learned to do in America in a foreign country, in a foreign language. That's something that's bigger than life as far as I see it. And so, yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Over the last 100 years, Disney has had a huge international influence, and because of that, there are generations of people who have grown up with the same movies and songs, but sometimes in completely different cultural and linguistic contexts. One time I was on a road trip with a friend, and I happened to be on a Tarzan soundtrack kick, so every place we went, that came up in conversation. And then one night we were in Italy, sitting outside of the Verona Arena drinking wine, while an Italian friend raved to me about how Phil Collins actually recorded the Tarzan soundtrack in Italian, and how certain lyrics just hit differently than they do in English. I don't speak Italian, and honestly, where I grew up in the US, learning a language was just another school subject. It took moving to Germany for me to realize that not only did speaking another language open up my world, but I also really enjoyed it. And by the way, Phil Collins also recorded the Tarzan soundtrack in a few other languages, including German. And honestly, I've come to like the German version of You'll Be in My Heart more than the original. When I went to Frankfurt for the German Donald Duck convention earlier this year, I was surprised at how the characters I love are appreciated elsewhere in ways I could have never imagined, and that I would have never even been aware of if I hadn't gotten on a plane a few years ago and let myself be uncomfortable enough to try something new. And though learning Greek started out as something I could do that wasn't related to music or YouTube, it quickly became clear that even in the future when I'm no longer regularly making videos about Disney, I won't be able to stop seeing it everywhere I go. And honestly, I'm looking forward to wherever I see it next.
Dir gehört mein Herz, nun bist du hier bei mir, denn dir gehört mein Herz, nur dir.